I'd like to begin with an example of a problem that I think is going to be familiar and perhaps even painfully familiar to all of us, which is the search for a place to live in the city. Now, where I live in San Francisco, California, there is a huge imbalance between supply and demand. There are many more people looking for an apartment than there are apartments available. And so this creates a particularly savage dynamic where you go to visit an apartment to have a look at it, and there might be 20 other people that show up with you at the same time. And often the keys end up with whoever can just physically force a deposit check on the landlord first. And what this means is that you find yourself needing to make essentially a binding, irrevocable commitment on first. Either you take the apartment in front of you right away, in which case you never know what else might have been out there, or you walk away, exploring your options, but knowing that you have forfeited your chance and you will never be able to change your mind. Now, I think San Francisco presents a particularly stark version of this problem, but the underlying dilemma exists in every housing market. There is perpetually new opportunities becoming available, and the existing opportunities are perpetually going. And I want to highlight that this sort of a decision really goes against the grain of our intuitions about what it means to be a rational decision maker. We have this idea that making a wise decision involves enumerating all of your possible options, carefully weighing each, and then selecting the one that you think is the best of them all. Here, in the housing search, you don't have the luxury of being able to do that. Instead, you need to make a choice between taking what's in front of you, knowing that there might be something better that's out there that you haven't explored, or continuing to explore new options, but potentially leaving your best option behind you. And so what do? How do you try to make the most informed decision when the very act of informing yourself might cost you your best opportunity? The critical consideration is not which of the options to pick, but how many options to even consider in the first place. And the very act of gathering information comes with a cost. And so what do? Well, it's a cruel situation to be in, bordering almost on paradox. But fortunately, there's an answer, and I'm happy to share it with you this morning. The answer is 37%. If you want the very best chance of the very best apartment, then you should spend the first 37% of your search. So if you've given yourself, let's say, a month to find a new place, then 37% of that month would be about 11 days. So for the first 11 days, leave your checkbook at home. You're just calibrating. And after that point, after that first 37%, be prepared to commit immediately to the first thing you see that's better than what you saw in that first 37%. This is not merely an intuitively satisfying compromise between looking and leaping. This is the provably optimal result. And we know this because the search for an apartment belongs to a class of problems that mathematicians and computer scientists know as optimal stopping problems. And an optimal stopping problem is any situation in which you face a series of opportunities one at a time, and at each point you must make a decision either to commit to what's in front of you or to walk away, never to return. Now, many people have argued that this sort of a decision-making structure not only describes our search for a place to live, it also describes perhaps our search for love. There comes a time in any relationship where you need to make a decision. You either need to go all in and commit to the person you're with, forsaking all others, or keep your options open, keep exploring what's out there, but in all likelihood, the chance to change your mind. And so you might be so bold as to just try to apply the 37% rule directly to your love life and define an interval of time over which you hope to find a mate. Just calculate 37% of that interval, in which case this would be like 26.1 years old, and decide this is exactly the threshold at which dating is going to go from just being out there having fun to getting ready for things to get serious. Of course, it all depends on the assumptions you're willing to make about love. Now, the thesis of what I want to talk about this morning is very simple. There's a set of problems that all of us face in life as a result of having finite time, finite information, and finite space. And they range from everything from where to live, how to find a mate, where to go out to dinner and what to order, how to arrange your messy closet, and how to schedule your time. We think of these as, in some sense, intrinsically and uniquely human problems. And the message that I want to deliver is they're not. In fact, they correspond very neatly and very fundamentally to some of the classic problems in computer science. And this gives us a real opportunity, I think, to learn something about how to make better decisions in our own lives by coming to better understand the characteristics of these problems and the properties of their optimal solutions. So we're going to, the book ultimately looks at this over 12 different domains, and this morning we're going to talk about 2 of these domains in detail, and I'll give a brief thumbnail sketch of the others at the end. And the first set of problems that I want to look at more closely are optimal stopping problems. Now, the 37% rule comes from the most famous optimal stopping problem of them all, which is called the quantary problem. The quantary problem comes from a 1960 column in Scientific American magazine by this man, Martin Gardner. And the setup, true to the 1960s, has this very sort of Mad Men flavor to it. You're this boss, you're this executive, you're trying to hire a secretary, and N candidates show up in a random order, and you have to interview them one at a time. After each interview, you either hire that secretary on the spot and send everyone else away, or you dismiss her and keep working your way through the applicant pool. Now, even though it was in the 1960s that this problem really came to grip the public mathematical imagination, the problem itself dates back more than a decade earlier. In fact, the first presentation of this problem to the public was done by this man, the mathematician Merrill Flood, in a talk that he gave at Princeton University in 1949. And it seems that Merrill Flood already had the problem's romantic implications in mind, even from the very beginning. You see, taking the minutes at this mathematical conference was Merrill Flood's daughter. She was 18 years old, and she had recently begun a relationship with a much older man. Flood and his wife strongly disapproved, and they thought about the way that they might try to express their sentiments to their daughter in a way that she might appreciate. And so Flood decides to give a presentation on this problem, which he at the time called the suitor problem, of how many people should you date before being willing to settle down and get married. And at this time, the 37% solution was actually not yet known, but he hoped that his daughter might take the hint that the correct answer was maybe more than one. Fortunately, she seems to have gotten the message, and the relationship was indeed short-lived. In the book, we present examples of mathematicians and computer scientists attempting to apply optimal stopping theory to their romantic lives, and having, I think it's fair to say, mixed success in doing so. And it highlights some of the ways in which the assumptions of the classical secretary problem deviate from some of these scenarios as we encounter them in real life. One of the people that I think best exemplifies this, and one of my favorite stories in particular, is the story of Carnegie Mellon professor of operations research, Michael Trick. Now, when Michael Trick was a younger man, he was in graduate school. He was living in Europe at the time. And he was starting to grapple with this question. He was in a relationship. It was going really well, but he thought in the back of his mind, well, how do I know if this is really the person I want to be with for the rest of my life? Suddenly it occurs to him, wait a minute, dating is basically like the secretary problem. And I'm an operations researcher. I can just run the numbers. So he does the math. He picks this interval of time over which he's hoping to meet his partner, multiplies it by 37%, comes out with 26.1 years of age. That happens to be his exact age at the time. And so he knows exactly what he needs to do. He proposes to his girlfriend on the spot, and she shoots him down. Now, Michael Trick experienced firsthand what mathematicians who study the optimal stopping problem know as rejection. It's actually called that in the technical literature. Fortunately, there's a way to modify the 37% rule to take account of the fact that your offer might not be accepted. And so it turns out, for instance, that if you have a 50% chance of being turned down, then the rate at which to switch from looking moves from 37% to just 25% of the way through the applicant pool. And if you're rejected, just keep going and try again. So the mathematical wisdom here appears to be something like propose early and often. Another famous scientist who has encountered in his own life ways in which the percent rule does and does not apply is the famous astronomer Johannes Kepler. After the death of Kepler's first wife, he embarks on this epic and exhausting series of courtships in order to try to meet the perfect woman to remarry. And he talks about this very candidly in his diaries and his letters. For example, the fourth woman that he meets, he's really drawn to her because of her tall build and athletic body, he writes. But he keeps on dating other women, and in fact, the fifth woman that he meets, he likes better. And she gets along really well with his kids. And he thinks, well, maybe she's the one. But if number 5 was better than number 4, well, why not just keep going? And so Kepler embarks on ultimately a series of 11 different courtships over a period of many years before he starts to have this sinking realization in the pit of his stomach that he's made a huge mistake. In fact, it was not alive all along. She's the right one for him. And so as soon as this hits him, he gets on a train to Regensburg, meets this woman, drops to one knee and says, I'm very sorry for dumping you and for the half dozen other people that I've been dating in the meantime, but if you can find it in your heart and you're not already engaged to someone else, I hope that you can take me back. Fortunately for Kepler, she agrees. And the rest of their lives is very happy together. Now, Kepler experienced what mathematicians who study the problem know as recall, which is the ability to go back and make an offer to a previous candidate or a previous opportunity that you've already dismissed. And here there's a simple modification of the 37% rule as well. So, for example, if you have a 50% chance of an offer being accepted, even if it's late, then what you should do is don't make any decisions until you are 61% of the way through your applicant pool. And then, if you fail to meet anyone in the remaining 39%, who's better than the best person from the first 61%, then prepare your best apology and get that train ticket to Regensburg. In his diary, Kepler really beats himself up for the way that he approached this decision. He bemoans what he calls his restlessness and doubtfulness of why did I keep on, meeting other people even when I had this really amazing person. And it may slightly put Kepler's mind at ease, but put his second wife's mind at ease, that Indeed, restlessness and doubtfulness, when you have the ability to recall past candidates, are part of the optimal solution, and you really should wait a long time before you're willing to commit. Well, the mathematics of optimal stopping go far beyond housing and romance. They also address what I think is one of the other biggest challenges of modern life, and that's when to park. Now, we've all had this situation happen to us where we're driving on our way to a venue, it's fairly crowded on the street, and we see a parking space appear. And we think to ourselves, well, I don't want to just take the first that I see and end up walking all the way to this venue and passing a bunch of other better spaces and feeling like an idiot. On the other hand, if I keep driving, then surely someone behind me is going to take that space away. And what if there isn't anything better that's closer to the venue? Then I'm going to have to circle back around and even farther, and then I'll feel like an even idiot. Well, fortunately, there comes to the rescue here as well. Okay. All right. So in the book, we include a chart that you can print out and just put on your dashboard in need of emergency. It turns out that the optimal place to pick a parking spot entirely depends on what's called the occupancy rate, which is what percentage of the spots are full. And so, for example, if 90% of the spaces are full, then you should not be willing to take an empty space until you are just 7 spots away from your destination, which is about half a city block. On the other hand, if the occupancy rate is 99% and just 1% of the spots are full, then you should not be willing to take a parking space, or rather you should be willing to take a parking space starting 69 spots away from your destination, which is something like a quarter of a mile. Now, we include figures beyond that, but at a certain point we just advise you, the math tells you, don't drive. I think looking at this more closely reveals something a bit deeper about the parking problem, which is that the math tells us not only how to make better decisions when we ourselves are behind the wheel, but it reveals something about the nature of parking as an urban planning problem. Traditionally, urban planners have thought of city parking as just a public resource whose use should be maximized. And so they viewed high occupancy rates as desirable in and of themselves. And typically, city governments would either make parking free or they would set the price of parking so low that people would use all of the spaces available. But taking a closer look reveals, I think, there's more to this story than that. Namely, going from an occupancy rate of 90% to 99% accommodates just 9% more cars, and yet it forces all of the drivers to drive 10 times as far looking for a space and to walk 10 times as far to their destination. There's been a new generation of urban planners who are leveraging the mathematics of optimal stopping to make the case that, in fact, city governments should set the price of parking to target an occupancy rate somewhere between 85 and 90%. And my home city of San Francisco has one of the first pilot programs where the parking meters in downtown automatically adjust their prices up and down to try to hit that balance of 85% occupancy at all times. Now, the downside of this is that the cost of public parking has gone dramatically up, but the benefit is that there's no more circling the block looking for an empty space and slowing up traffic while you're at it. The person who's considered to be the guru and the leader of this movement is the UCLA professor of urban planning, Donald Shoup, who has been called by the Los Angeles Times the parking rock star of the modern era. And as part of my research into optimal stopping problems, I went down to UCLA and I interviewed Donald Shoup. And I would say no one understands as well as he does the full computational dynamics of everything that goes into finding the perfect parking spot. And so I said to him, Professor Shoup, is there anything that you've learned in your research on this problem that has enabled you to optimize your own commute to the UCLA campus through the notoriously hellish Los Angeles gridlock? His eyes lit up and he said, yes, absolutely. I ride my bike. Now, it may seem that this constraint that is necessary in every optimal stopping problem, that we encounter each of these opportunities exactly one time, and then we move on and can never go back. It may seem at first that this is a little bit extreme or a little bit unrealistic, or that this doesn't quite describe a lot of the scenarios that we find ourselves in. But in fact, I want to make the argument that optimal stopping really describes any situation in which we need to make a decision where time is a factor. In fact, so many of the choices that we make in our lives are decisions about when is the right time to take a certain action. When is the right time to exercise your stock options? When is the right time to pop the cork on that fancy bottle of wine that you've been saving for just the right occasion? You know, when is the right time to interrupt someone when they're speaking? Or when is the right time to kiss someone? So many of the decisions that we make are comprised of these fleeting moments where we can either take an action or not. And if we don't, then we never have the opportunity to go back and change our mind. In fact, optimal stopping describes not only these sorts of situations, but really any situation in which we pay a cost of any kind for continuing to think and continuing to wait and continuing to explore and gather more information. And really, I think every choice that we make, whether it's looking for a new job or trying to find the best flight to get us from point A to point B, involves necessarily some moment at which we decide we are going to look no further. That the cost in terms of time and energy and money that we pay to continue gathering information just isn't worth it, and we need to just go with the best thing that we know about right now. In this sense, I think every single decision that we make is implicitly a decision about how hard we want to think and how long we want to think about something, and critically, when we want to stop. Now, the second category of problems that I want to talk about are ones in which, unlike in optimal stopping problems where we make a single binding commitment and are wedded to that forever, there's a whole other class of problems where we make decisions over and over and over again, and we get to learn along the way. And I think this is best typified by the choice of where we want to go out to eat. We've all had this argument among friends where we're deciding where we want to go, and someone says, well, let's just go to our favorite place that we always go to. And someone else says, no, come on, we always do that. Let's try the new place that just opened up. Well, once you decide on a place to eat, this same tension exists when you open the menu. Do you eat your favorite thing that you always like to eat, or do you ask about the specials and try something new? And on the way there, what music do you listen to? Do you listen to one of your favorite albums that you know and love, or do you try to explore and discover new artists that you might like just as much? And who do you take to dinner? Do you take some of your closest friends or your spouse or your immediate family, or do you try to make better friends with a new acquaintance or reach out to someone who's just joined the office? It seems that so much of life consists of this exact tension between doing our favorite things and trying new things. And when I was growing up, we had these poems and expressions like, make new friends but keep the old. One is silver and the other is gold. And I think, wisdom like this acknowledges the tension between these two things, but it doesn't really tell us anything about what balance we should be striking. Well, fortunately, there's a group of people who have been thinking about how to strike this exact balance for the last 60 years, and they are computer scientists. In fact, they even have a name for it. They call it the explore-exploit trade-off. Now, this idea might be familiar to some of you from engineering and software development, but if it's not, I think one of the best examples of this tension and this trade-off comes from Google. So the last quarterly shareholders report that I read, Google made something like 95% of their revenue from putting ads next to search queries. And so hundreds of billions of dollars are at stake in determining exactly which ad to show next to exactly which search query. In particular, for any given query that you might make, so for example, if you search for something like home loans, there is going to be a huge pool of ads in the system that each has its own track record of how many times it was shown to users, and out of that number, how many times did the user click on it. So there's always going to be some ad that has the best historical track record of getting people to click on it. But there are many other ads that we just don't have as much information about, and there's always new ads coming into the system that we don't have any information about at all. And so what do? If we want to try to maximize our revenue, what percentage of the time do we just show users ads that we know are going to get clicks? And what percentage of the time do we reserve for experimenting with ads that might be better, they might be worse, we just don't know? How exactly do we strike that balance, and what exact proportion do we want to strike it at? Well, this turns out to be one of the oldest problems in computer science, and it goes back to the early 20th century, and it's known in the literature as the multi-armed bandit problem. Now, again, this might be familiar to some of you who work in web development, but for anyone who's not familiar with the multi-armed bandit problem, the name, the strange-sounding name, comes from the idea of a casino slot machine, which is nicknamed the one-armed bandit because it has a single lever on the side and it takes all of your money. Now, the multi-armed bandit problem imagines that you walk in through the doors of a casino that has hundreds of different slot machines. Now, in this casino, all of the slot machines pay off at different probabilities. Some of them are better, some of them are worse. And critically, you don't know which are which until you walk in the door and start playing them. And so, quite simply, what do? You want to make as much money as you possibly can. And so I think intuitively, you're going to want to do some kind of combination of trying some machines out, seeing which ones appear to be better than which others, but also you're going to want to just spend a lot of your money just cranking away on the handles of those machines that do seem the best. Of course, the question is, what exact strategy strikes this balance the best? And for most of the 20th century, the multi-armed bandit problem was considered not just an unsolved problem, but an unsolvable problem. It was considered career suicide to work on this. And in fact, the British Allied mathematicians during World War II joked about dropping the multi-armed bandit problem over Germany as the ultimate instrument of intellectual sabotage, just wasting the brain power of the German scientists. But to the field's own surprise, there, in the second half of the 20th century, began a series of breakthroughs on the problem, led by this guy, Richard Bellman, who in the late 50s developed a technique called dynamic programming that allows for some specific exact answers to the multi-armed bandit problem, provided that a number of different constraints are met. And a closer look at the nature of those solutions, I think, gives us some much broader and deeper insights into the problem. So to make things very concrete, let's imagine that you're in a casino that has just 2 slot machines. The first you've played 15 times. 9 times the machine paid out, and 6 times it didn't. The second machine you've only played twice. Once it paid out, and once it didn't. And so, quite simply, what do you do next? What is the most rational machine to play with your very next dollar? Well, the simplest thing to do is just to calculate the winning percentage of each machine so far. So the first machine has paid out 60% of the time. The second machine has paid out 50% of the time. And so I think it's intuitive to just say, well, let's just play the machine with the higher expected value. But there's this nagging feeling that we just don't know enough about that second machine to write it off completely. So what do you do? Well, it turns out that the answer depends entirely on something that we haven't mentioned explicitly yet, which is how long you plan to be in the casino. And this is a concept that we call the interval. And so to illustrate this concept, imagine that you've just accepted a new job and you're going to be living in Spain for a year. Your first night in Spain, you show up and you wander around the city and you go out to a restaurant. That first restaurant that you eat at, your first night in Spain, is guaranteed to be the greatest restaurant you have ever been to in Spain. It's not bad. The second night, you go out and you try another restaurant. It has a 50% chance of being the greatest restaurant you've ever been to in Spain. The third night, you go out. It's got a 1 in 3 chance of being the greatest restaurant you've ever been to in Spain. And you can see how this goes from here. Namely, the chance that a new random option is going to be better than 1 over n, as your experience allows you to set a higher bar. And there's another important factor here too, which is that the value of making that great new discovery goes down as a function of time, as you run out of opportunities to go back. So, for example, if you go to this incredible restaurant on your last night in Spain, and it's mind-blowing, and it's better than everything you've known about so far, there's something about that that's actually a little bit tragic, right? You think to yourself, well, it would have been great to know about that, 9 months ago. And so for both of these reasons, the odds of making a great new discovery and the value of making that discovery just monotonically go down as a function of time. On the other hand, the value of doing the best thing that you know about, just going to that amazing restaurant that's your favorite place and getting your usual order, the value of doing that can only go up as a function of your experience. And the best place you know about on your last night in town is by definition at least as good as the best place you knew about 6 months in. And in fact, it's probably better. And so for all of these reasons, we should naturally front-load our exploration and spend more time at the end of our interval just doing the things that we already know about and love. And so I think this puts all of us on an arc, on a trajectory, where our decision-making is going to naturally evolve and change just as a function of time, and where we see ourselves within whatever is the relevant interval over which we're making that decision. Now, this intuition has given me, for example, the ability to completely reevaluate one of my favorite films, which is the 1989 inspirational classic Dead Poets Society, starring Robin Williams. If you haven't seen it, Robin Williams plays this young poetry professor who gives these really inspiring monologues to his students that say things like, "Seize the day, boys. Make your lives extraordinary." Well, equipped with the knowledge of the multi-armed bandit problem, I think we're prepared to cry foul here. Because it turns out that Robin Williams is in fact giving 2 mutually exclusive pieces of advice. If we're just trying to seize the day, then by all means we should just pull the handle of that machine with the best expected value. But if we want to make our entire lives extraordinary, then it's worth investing that energy in trying the option that we just don't know as much about. Because if it's even better than what we know about, we've got the rest of our lives to enjoy it. And if it's not, we've got the rest of our lives to go back to doing what we were doing before. Now, one of the things that I've been really fascinated by is watching these ideas move out of computer science into some of the neighboring fields like cognitive science and psychology, where they are reshaping the way that we think about how human decision-making changes over the course of human lifespan. And they're changing and challenging some of our ideas, both of what it means to be young and what it means to be old. So to represent the beginning of our life, here's a picture of an infant plugging a power cord into its face. I think this really exemplifies some of the stereotypes and preconceptions that we have about being young. We think of children as just kind of random. They have a really short attention span. They just wander around aimlessly. They exhibit what psychologists call a strong novelty bias, which is no matter how carefully you choose just the right toy to give them for Christmas, they're just relentlessly interested in the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And I think it's tempting to view infants as kind of just defective versions of adults that just haven't learned, focused attention and willpower yet. But in fact, there's a completely different story that we can tell about the beginning of life. And this is coming from the UC Berkeley professor Alison Gopnik, who is drawing some of these ideas out of the explore-exploit trade-off from computer science and saying, well, let's think about this differently. If you're an infant, you have just burst through the doors of life's casino, and you're going to be there for 80 years. Perhaps your optimal strategy really is just exploring randomly for a long time. Maybe you really should just run around that casino pulling levers at random and just seeing what happens. Maybe you really should just crawl around your living room, putting every single object into your mouth at least once, because it could be delicious. And if it is, you have 80 years to enjoy it. In fact, this idea also starts to address one of the great paradoxes of human cognition that has kind of troubled psychologists over the years. Namely, humans have this uniquely long period of dependence on their parents. You don't see that in other species. So my favorite example of this is that a baby gazelle can, within 3 hours of being born, outrun a predatory cheetah with 95% chance of success. Within 3 hours of being born. Humans are basically useless for the first 2 decades. So how do you make sense of that? How do you explain, the human dominance over the planet and reconcile that with this incredibly long period of dependence upon our elders? Well, again, perhaps the explore-exploit trade-off gives us a key to unlocking this mystery. And indeed, psychologists like Alison Gopnik are now making this argument that if you think about life as this giant explore-exploit trade-off, this giant multi-armed bandit problem, then parents are really providing a valuable service to their children. By spending those first 2 decades giving them a roof over their head and meals, 3 meals a day, and protecting them from the predatory cheetahs, human infants are not dependent on those early payouts in order to survive. They don't require being immediately competent at any particular thing. And so they can spend much more time learning and developing and playing the piccolo and learning React and doing all the things that we do in order to get ready to make a contribution to the world. And in so doing, the math tells us that we should expect better payouts at the end of our lives, which is, in fact, exactly what we get. Now, I think this leads us to a reevaluation of what it means to be in our older years. So, to exemplify the stereotypes that we have about older adults, here's a picture of a man. And I like to imagine him as sitting in the exact same diner booth of the same restaurant where he goes every Friday at 4 p.m., ordering the exact same ice cream cone because they make it exactly the way that he likes it. Now, we have a lot of stereotypes about what it means to get older. We think of older adults as being kind of set in their ways, very resistant to new ideas, resistant to change. There's this whole psychological literature that shows that we maintain fewer and fewer close social connections as we go through life. And I think it's tempting to view that and think, oh, maybe there's something just kind of sad or lonely about getting older. In fact, there's a totally different story we can tell. And psychologists, led by Stanford's Laura Carstensen, are appealing to the multi-armed bandit problem and saying, no. In fact, older adults have just entered the exploit phase of their life, where they do not care about exploring other things. They are just going to pull the handle of those machines that they know pay out the best. They're not going to waste their time on their flaky coworker who, is late and doesn't show up half the time. They're just going to focus their attention on the people that matter most, the people that are closest to them, that they care about the most. And in fact, her studies of older adults show that they are doing this very much thoughtfully and very deliberately as a strategy, and it's just the rational thing to do when you've come to the end of your life, to leverage a lifetime's worth of explorations and do the things that matter the most. And in fact, contrary to some of our intuitions, the math tells us that older adults should be consistently happier than younger people. And her research shows that this is in fact the case. So there's something, I think, to look forward to about being in the exploit phase of our lives. Now let's have a closer look at the actual algorithms behind the multi-armed bandit problem and the mathematics of what those solutions look like. So there's a handful of very simple, very straightforward algorithms that computer scientists have identified that can offer us something that's called minimal regret in the multi-armed bandit problem. And so what is regret to a mathematician? Well, in the multi-armed bandit problem, you can formalize this notion of regret by just saying it's all the money that you left on the table. It's all the money that you could have made in that casino if only you knew at the beginning everything that you knew at the end. And I actually think this is a very sort of apt and kind of beautiful way of formalizing the notion of regret in life. And it turns out that there's this family of very simple, very intuitive algorithms that offer this wonderful property that they are what's called regret minimizing strategies. Now, the first is what's called Thompson sampling, which just says you should do everything in proportion to how sure you are that it's the best thing to do. So if you are 80% sure that a steakhouse is the best steakhouse in town, you should go there 80% of the time. If you're only 50% sure that a cafe makes the best espresso, you should only go there half the time. And it turns out that this extremely intuitive strategy offers this property of minimal regret. Another equally simple algorithm is what's called epsilon decreasing. And this just says, spend a certain proportion of your time doing new things completely randomly, but then slowly taper off the amount of time that you spend doing that. So when you first move to a city, maybe 5 nights a week, go somewhere that you've never been before. After a couple months, maybe do that twice a week. Then just once a week. Then after a few years, maybe just once a month. And this strategy also offers us this property that it's regret minimizing. Lastly, one of my absolute favorite algorithms for the multi-armed bandit problem is what's called upper confidence bound. So perhaps you're familiar with the idea from statistics of a confidence interval that indicates the range over which you think the outcome is going to fall. Well, upper confidence bound says, ignore the mean of that distribution, ignore the lower bound, focus entirely on doing the thing with the highest upper bound out of all the options. Put a little bit more plainly, this is do the thing that has the best case scenario. And I think there's something really beautiful about the idea that confidence and just being willing to focus on the bright side, on the best possible outcome of a situation, is mathematically one of the best ways to avoid regret in life. It's the sort of computational argument for optimism. Now, considering how your regret grows over time when you are playing a multi-armed bandit problem reveals something that I think it's a mixed blessing. There's sort of good news and bad news. So I'll give you the bad news first. So even when you are following one of these optimal regret minimizing strategies, you are going to have what is called logarithmic regret. So your regret will continue growing forever. So this is the bad news. You will never stop having additional regrets. The amount of money that you leave on the table of life's casino will continue growing forever. The good news is that the rate at which you add new regrets will be forever going down over time. So you will make fewer and fewer mistakes, and the mistakes that you make will be smaller and smaller in amplitude. And I feel like I can live with that. I'm okay with that. Now, this idea of how do we minimize regret has not only affected psychologists and cognitive scientists, it has also moved outside of computer science and is now affecting the world of medicine. In particular, it's reshaping the way that we think about the process of clinical trials. Now, I don't know if this picture from The Matrix is necessarily the best summary of clinical trials, but I think it gets the idea across. So in your classic randomized controlled trial, for any condition, there is some treatment that is the best known treatment for that condition, and there's a new treatment that has just been developed, and we don't know enough about it yet. It could be much better, but it could also be worse. And so what do? How many people do we expose to the new treatment? How many people do we give the old conventional treatment? Well, if you read the medical ethics literature, people have been, agonizing about this for hundreds of years, and it is considered sort of a suspension of the norms of medical ethics, which say to just always provide the best possible standard of care to each patient in front of you. Clinical trials are regarded as this kind of weird exception to this rule. But perhaps it doesn't need to be the case. And so if you think about the way that a classic randomized controlled trial is run, you would do something like pick a population of people and just divide them in half. Half the people you give the original treatment, half the people you give the new treatment, and then you don't pay attention to what the results are until the very end, and then you see what happened. Well, to anyone who works in engineering and does, let's say, A/B testing on a website, this would seem like an insane and medieval way to go about this, right? You would never just give half of your users one thing, half the other, and then just walk away and say, we'll just check this, later and see what happened. I think it's much more considered to be the best practice in the industry that what you actually want to do is what's called an adaptive trial, where you're getting information along the way and you're using that information to dynamically adjust which proportion of people see which version of your site. And the same thing is now coming to medicine, where people are saying, with each single trial that we do, we get a little bit of information. And so if the conventional treatment starts looking worse and worse and worse, let's just naturally give fewer and fewer and fewer of those people that treatment. This idea has now started moving out of the kind of theoretical bioethics literature, and in the United States has made its way all the way to the Food and Drug Administration, which has released what they call draft guidance, basically saying, these computer scientists might be onto something, let's take a look. And so on the one hand, I think some people are making this argument that it seems kind of cold and detached to appeal to something like an algorithm in a case where human lives are on the line. But I think there's just as strong of a counter-argument that says, when human lives are on the line and the stakes are highest, how can you not do something that is provably regret minimizing in cases where regret might be measured in human lives? And so, taken together, I think this really shows us that there are insights and rewards at multiple scales that come from identifying this underlying computational structure of the problems that we face in everyday life. It gives us some straightforward tips about how to choose which restaurant to go out to on a given night. It gives us some kind of philosophical and psychological insight into how our decision-making should naturally change and evolve as we go through the course of human life. And in the case of medicine, it can also offer us some surprisingly explicit guidance in the cases where the stakes are the highest. Now, I mentioned that the book ultimately looks at this line of thought, uncovering the underlying computational structure of human decisions in a total of 12 different domains. So in the sorting chapter, we look at the question of what can some of these canonical sorting algorithms from computer science tell us about, for example, what's the best way to alphabetize your bookshelf at home? And more importantly, whether you should. And in fact, it turns out there's a very powerful computational argument for the virtues and the benefits of mess that come from thinking about sorting. In the caching chapter, we look at the best way to manage your limited space given what computer scientists have now learned over the past several decades about the best way to handle cache eviction. And we look at advice from home organization gurus like Martha Stewart and ask whether she passes muster and, in fact, offers provably optimal tips for managing your home. Scheduling is another domain where every computer operating system, as many of you know, has what's called a kernel scheduler that manages the time of the CPU and the attention, and decides how long are we going to be working on the next thing that we're working on? When do we switch? And critically, what do we switch to next? And so we can think about some of our own time management struggles with procrastination and so forth through the lens of kernel scheduling and say, what can we learn about how to better structure time in our own lives? Our chapter on Bayes' rule looks at this question of how do you make optimal predictions about the future, often given extremely limited information. So how do you decide things like when you think the next bus is going to arrive, given when the last one came, for example? And here there are some beautifully simple algorithms that can give us some really great guidance. And one of my favorite is what's called the Copernican principle, which is named after the famous Polish astronomer Copernicus. And this tells us that if you don't know anything else about how long a process is going to continue, you should just assume that you are exactly halfway through that process. So if you are dating someone and things have been going really well, you've been seeing them for a month, how long should you imagine that the relationship is going to last? Probably about 1 more month. And so we give some very concrete advice here. So for example, if you were just recently at home for Easter and you met this really cute guy or girl at Schmingus Dingus, is it too early to book those New Year's Eve tickets? The answer is yes. When is the right time to book those New Year's tickets? The answer is Friday, August 17th. So we've got you covered. The second half of the book looks at questions where we not only face problems posed by the environment, but we pose problems to one another. And so game theory and this idea that we call computational kindness gives us a way of thinking ethically about how to pose one another problems in a way that is what we call computationally kind. And this is something else that understanding the underlying structure of the problems that we face enables you to think altruistically about how you interact with other people. And critically, the second half of the book also looks at what are called intractable problems. And so I want to just spend a few moments talking about this as we wrap up. So, as many of us know, there's a huge set of problems within the computer science literature that are what are called intractable. What this means is that, unfortunately, there just is no simple, effective, optimal strategy that's going to just efficiently get you the right answer every time. And so what do? Of course, you don't just give up. In fact, computer science has developed this huge arsenal of strategies for how you try to make headway against an intractable problem, using things like relaxation and randomness and approximations. And this set of strategies, I think, gives us not only a set of tools for dealing with some of the hairiest and messiest problems in life, but it actually gives us an opportunity to rethink what we even mean by rational decision-making and rational thought. And it doesn't really look like the story that we've been used to hearing. In particular, we think about rationality as being 3 things. It's exhaustive. We consider all of our options before making a decision. It's deterministic. We follow this reliable procedure that's guaranteed to go the same way every time and hopefully get us the same answer every time. And it's exact. Not only do we arrive at an answer which is itself incredibly precise, but we are very certain that we have arrived at the answer when we do. Now, if you look at the way that computer scientists deal with intractable problems, you find that, in fact, rationally making progress against a difficult enough problem is none of these things. It's not exhaustive. It considers only a small subset of the options available. It's not deterministic. It makes heavy use of randomness. It follows strategies that may not be guaranteed to succeed every single time. And it's not exact. It often gives us an answer that is within a certain bound of the optimal answer, and we just accept that that's good enough. And this is happening even at some of the highest stakes areas of computer science. So one of my very favorite examples of this is in cryptography. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the mathematician G.H. Hardy boasted of why he was so happy to be studying prime numbers, because he considered them the most obviously useless branch of mathematics. As we know, the study of prime numbers not only became useful, but in fact became a matter of national security and the underpinnings of the entire international e-commerce at the end of the 20th century. And so the world has never needed to know more about prime numbers than it does today. And in particular, we need really efficient ways of deciding whether a large randomly generated number is in fact prime or not. And this is known as a primality test. It turns out that the most popular primality test in use today is what's called the Miller-Rabin test. It just so happens that the Miller-Rabin test is wrong 25% of the time. So when I was researching this, I called up one of the implementers of OpenSSL, and I said to him, well, how do you guys deal with the fact that the Miller-Rabin test is wrong 25% of the time? And he said, well, we just run it 40 times. And so then you just have a 1 over 4 to the 40th power, which is like 1 in a million, billion chance of being wrong, and that's just good enough. What I think is really beautiful about this is that in the 2000s, a polynomial time deterministic primality test algorithm was discovered, and we still use the Miller-Rabin test anyway because it's just so much more efficient. And I think taken together, this paints a picture of rational decision-making that gives us some advice that isn't necessarily what we might imagine living by the principles of computer science to look like. And in particular, it gives us a vision of life that is, I think, more approachable, more recognizable, and more human. It tells us things like, don't always consider all of your options. Don't necessarily go for the outcome that seems the best every single time. Make a mess on occasion. Travel light. Let things wait. Trust your instincts and don't think too long. And sometimes even just relax and toss a coin. And unlike the advice that you might get in, say, most self-help books, they're backed by proofs. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions. So if there are folks who want to ask me about anything that we've talked about, I'll put the chapter list here. Yeah. Is there a microphone in the audience? Do we have, yeah?
Can you give the example of upper bounds constraint? You talked about the free strategies.
Yeah.
And there was this upper bounds.
Yeah.
Yeah. This
yep.
one, minimal regret. Can you give the example how to employ it?
How to use this? Yeah. So there's a particular algorithm that's used in multi-arm bandit situations that's called upper confidence bound. It's also known as UCB1, if you want to search in the technical literature. And it uses a very specific mathematical definition of confidence bound, which is called the Chernoff-Hofting bound. But you can use, I think intuitively you could just think of it as like a confidence interval in your sort of classic statistics. And this says, if you've got some uncertainty over how good each of your options is, so you have all these different ads, and one of them, you've shown it a certain number of times, and so you have a certain kind of bell curve of uncertainty around how good you think that ad might be. The next ad you should show is the ad with the best kind of right tail of that distribution, or the best top of its confidence interval. And so this is a strategy that kind of very organically trades off between exploration and exploitation, because the more information that you gather about an option, the tighter your confidence interval is going to be around the mean. And so it's going to just naturally trade off between doing things that, on the one hand, you're very certain are quite good, versus other things that might be worse, but you just have a lot more uncertainty. And so it's a very elegant way for kind of managing the trade-off between those two things. I also think it's just very beautiful. It's sort of very poetic to imagine. All you care about is the best realistic, best case scenario. Is that it? Okay, thank you very much.